Hey everyone, this is Ian from Unincorporated, and I wanted to welcome you to another edition of the Higher Ed Happy Hour. Today, I'm here with Christopher Zara. Christopher is a senior editor at Fast Company, where he runs the news desk and was previously a deputy editor for the International Business Times. Christopher Zara is also the author of a new book titled Uneducated, a memoir of flunking out, falling apart, and finding my worth, which shares his experience as a high school dropout in the elite world of New York City media. Today, we're going to be talking to Christopher about how a lack of access to higher education limits people's options, why attitudes around degree requirements are changing, and what that means for colleges. Christopher, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure. So let's talk about your memoir, Uneducated. Obviously, this is a very personal account of you
hmm
navigating the professional world without that coveted college degree.
Yes.
What are some of your insights just from that journey that may shed light on the challenges that you faced?
Yeah, sure. So, I came from a pretty working class background where not going to college, not even finishing high school in many cases, was not unusual. Um, in that respect, my story wasn't that unusual. I had some behavioral issues in high school and made it to 11th grade before they finally threw me out. I did manage to get a GED that same year, but I really didn't go very far when it came to schooling. And I kind of I sort of wandered around for the next decade or so. I got into some problems with drugs and worked a lot of retail jobs and just sort of spent that entire decade, really up until I was in my early 30s, trying to, figure out what I was going to do with my life. It wasn't until I came to New York City at the age of 35 and decided to take an unpaid internship at a newspaper that I learned the craft of journalism essentially. So I learned really on the job through that internship. It was a really small newspaper, and I eventually got a staff job there. And having a staff job at that small newspaper really gave me experience doing just about anything there was to do at a newspaper. So I learned a lot at that small publication in New York City. I worked there for about 6 years and sort of used that as a springboard to other journalism jobs. Throughout my career, I've been in the game for now about 20 years. It occurred to me that my background was really different in media. That most people who work in media, who work as journalists, they go to school for it. They don't necessarily go to school for journalism, but they go to some school, and
Hmm.
it's often very good schools. My colleagues are very frequently, graduates of Ivy League universities, J schools like Columbia, Northwestern, that kind of thing. Um, and the contrast between them and my own background really became noticeable to me the farther along I went. So the more I became like a senior editor and was in charge of hiring and in charge of managing people, the more my background stood out to me. Um, and I thought there was a perspective there that was worth sharing about education itself. When I looked at a lot of the research and a lot of the literature on the education divide, uh, obviously a lot of it is written by people who went to college, which makes sense because those are the academics who study this kind of thing. But I really did think I thought there was room for a story about education and about college from someone who didn't benefit from it like I did. And so that's the main thrust of the book and the main idea behind it.
Yeah. Well, you've overcome such significant hurdles in terms of perception and yeah, how that kind of cultural identity is shaped within the professional world and how it hinges or depends on, what school you went to, the
Right.
faculty maybe that you engaged with, what kind of publishing maybe that you've done up until the point where you start your career. But this idea that you felt compelled to tell a side of the educational divide or a perspective of the uneducated and those challenges,
hmm
and I'm using air quotes here because that in itself I think is a misnomer, the uneducated, right?
Yeah, and it's sort of the point of the title. I mean, it's obviously
Yeah.
meant to be. air quoted when you say it. I wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't legitimately call someone uneducated.
Yeah.
But that's sort of the point.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's probably other cases within the market where books on, a particular topic are written by the academics or,
Yeah.
by those who don't have firsthand experience. So I think that's quite noble that you went out and shared that perspective. I know that the book explores how education defines and shapes our identities and
Yeah.
really shapes kind of the value that's associated with our identities. And that's both cultural, societal. I think we learn of that maybe less now in the gig economy than we once
Yeah.
did, but we learn of that through our families. um, can you just elaborate a little bit more on how the perception of education in society influences those individuals?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of ironic thing is even someone like myself with no real formal education, excuse me, I'm still defining myself around education as a quantity, and the reason that is, I think, is because in my case, it's a little different because I'm surrounded by people all day long who are college graduates, so I see firsthand through their experiences what college brings to the table. And in a lot of ways, it really made me realize what I'd missed out on as someone who didn't go to school, because I was forced to work shoulder to shoulder with such highly educated, maybe quote unquote highly educated, but people who are who went all the way in school. So being on sort of the margins of society as someone who didn't really finish high school, and being forced to kind of intermingle through the profession of journalism, was really what showed me how the education has this power. I was so scared for the topic of education to come up in my newsroom that I would, sometimes like slither or sneak away if like I heard people talking about like where they went to school, or different aspects of their college experience. Like I knew that, the subject might come around to me and someone would be like, "Hey, Zara, where did you go to school?" And like, most people I worked with didn't know because they don't look at your resume when you're kind of thrown in with them. So they might, unless they're looking me up on LinkedIn, they might not know. And I was just terrified that the subject would come up and I would have to sort of overly explain this backstory of mine.
Yeah, that must have created a lot of stress and anxiety at times. I could only imagine.
Yeah, and I'm
Did you
anxiety
feel
prone to begin with, so it
right?
didn't
Yeah,
help.
aren't we all?
I'm sweating right now just having this interview.
Well, that's because it's a balmy 90 degrees in New York City right
That's
now, but
true. Yeah, that doesn't help the situation.
no, it doesn't. It doesn't. So obviously you internalized that feeling and that anxiety, and you said you were terrified that this subject may come up within
Yeah.
the professional setting. Did you also feel distinctly different from those colleagues of yours, that those peers that were, again, air quotes, educated, or at least had gone to college or Ivy League? Like, did you feel it from a professional standard? Did you feel different than them?
I did at times. I think it really depended on what we were covering. Politically, I probably aligned with most of them on most things. Just I think that there's this this somewhat false narrative that journalists are all the same political stripes. There may be some truth to it. I found that maybe 80% of the time, if we were writing stories, there was not any sort of conflict, but there were times, I think, as I write in the book, like especially during the early Trump era, like that, it became apparent that the white, quote unquote, white working class was going to be part of the narrative of this election of 2016. That's somewhat, I fall into that category by definition, because that's the category that was being defined as white people without college degrees. That's me. I didn't feel that those articles necessarily accurately described me or most people that I know. So I think there was a bit of a conflict there. I was also, again, in a somewhat in a position there to really, and I wasn't in a position there to really do much to change it because I was, again, afraid. I think I was a little bit afraid to rock the boat. So I did sort of, in a lot of ways, toe the line with the coverage. Um, but so yeah, to answer your question, there were times when coverage would demand a certain point of view, and I felt that the perspectives were different.
Hmm. How about in terms of like skills or capabilities or one's like critical thinking ability? Did you feel that you were on equal ground with those that had attended higher education?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think it's hard to evaluate yourself. I can say that having learned most of what I do on the job, there were definitely moments when I felt like I should know this thing, but I don't. And often those were cultural references, which the stakes are kind of low with some of this stuff. Like maybe it's a cultural reference about a website that everyone read in college. I remember this website called The Toast, I think it was called. The millennials loved it, and it was a there was, I think it was going out of business at some point, and I was like, what is this thing? Why don't I even know about it? So there were definitely little moments like that. um, I think on the flip side of that, I learned certain elements of the profession by reading it up on it myself, like AP style, or the philosophy on plagiarism, or different aspects that you need to know when you work as a journalist. These were things that I just had to learn on my own. Um, I didn't see a whole lot of evidence that the college educated journalists knew some of that stuff any more than I did. Um, so yeah, I guess
Yeah,
it would depend.
yeah, it's a fair answer. How about in terms of making it a strategic advantage or in some way like giving you an upper hand in critical thinking or developing a perspective for a piece? I
Yeah,
know that that's an advantage in the case of the book, right? Because you have firsthand experience
yeah.
on this topic. But how about within the professional world and how you approached your work assignments? Did you feel like you had an advantage at any point?
Yeah, I think that the biggest, I would say that if I could view this objectively, it's really hard to do. But some of the big, I think the biggest advantage that I had counterintuitively was the fear of not belonging there, and that really made me want to work harder. And it often meant staying late. It meant working. It meant turning in, you know, doubling down on assignments, and doing more
Mhm.
than was necessary. This was especially true during my first job because I had to put up with like a boss that was sort of unstable, and no one could deal with this guy, and like he constantly people would be in and out of that office and be like, I just can't work here. I can't work under these conditions. For me, it was like I didn't have a choice. I have to figure this out, and I have to do it. And I think in that
Mhm.
case, it was a real advantage. I think I did take some of that. I hate to use the word grit because that sounds like I'm giving myself a compliment, but I think I took some of that grit to my future jobs as well. And journalism is a scrappy business. I mean, it's always on the cusp of being disrupted by technology or by competitors or by something. So I do think there is an advantage to feeling like to feeling that sense of urgency that this is not, you are not owed this career, and it could end at any time, and so you really need to be on your best game as much as you can. I can't speak for people directly who went to school for journalism, but I can say that if you study it and you spend a couple of years um, in a classroom learning it, and then you go out and you start doing it, maybe there's more of a sense of, of course I'm doing this job. I went to school for it, and here I am, and I deserve to be here. Whereas in my case, it was the opposite. I always had the sense that I didn't deserve to be there, and that I think that did make me probably feel like I had to work a little bit harder at times.
Yeah, that's great. You turned it into a superpower.
Yeah, I like to kind of look at it that way. I don't know if that's the whole truth, but yeah, I think that it definitely came in handy.
Yeah. Well, it clearly motivated you to work harder, as you put it, and maybe gave you a little resistance or buffer to that sensation of entitlement.
Yeah.
And in the end, maybe you learned faster and produced better work. Once you made that transition from kind of the personal world into the professional persona.
Yeah.
These days, the power of education or the power of higher ed to really define who people are, I feel like that's diminishing, especially with the rise of content
Mm.
creators on a somewhat decentralized, although it's usually found within social media, but you know a decentralized marketplace where anyone can become a kind of like a financial capitalist or a capitalist or a producer of some in some way, and they can define themselves around their influence. Do you think that that is inherently a good thing, that the higher ed is maybe not as coveted as this is the path and this is the trajectory that you need to go to be successful?
I do think it's good. I think that the first thing I would say on that is I never wanted the book Uneducated to come off as being anti-college. If you
Hmm.
really look at the what I'm trying to say, the story is really about how it's the exact opposite. Like, I understand why education is so important, having not had it. Um,
Hmm.
that being said, I do think that like there it to me the job, not just the job market but society in general, has been skewed a little too far in the direction of making college this important attribute that everyone had to have. That was especially apparent. I think it was supercharged after the 2008 financial crisis, when there was really this shift of um, employers demanding college degrees. And I think if we shift back a little bit and give some power back to people who didn't go to college and have alternative pathways, like I think that that's good. I do think it's good. I think there should be room for both types of learning in the world.
Hmm. Yeah, and what would you say then to the dean or the president of a university that hears that perspective, that hey, it's okay that that your school isn't the first choice or isn't a necessity for success? Do you have any perspective that you would share with that dean, or words of
I
advice on how to adapt to this trend?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably going to sound a little bit obvious, but I think to the extent that schools can really make themselves more accessible, uh, that should be a priority for schools. I think, and that I'm saying that as an outsider. I'm sure, like if I were face to face with the dean of a big school, they'd be like, "Well, duh, like we haven't thought of that." But that's really the thing. Like access. Obviously, the cost of college is probably the single most biggest factor in terms of like access, right? So if to the extent that that colleges can figure out how to bring the costs down, I think that would bring us closer to this world where we could have it both ways. Where people could study in an alternative setting or go to a regular college if they wanted to. College is inaccessible to a lot of people. It was inaccessible to me, and it's inaccessible to people who can't afford it. And I mean, yeah, sure, there's definitely options. There's ways around it. There's scholarships and things like that. But to make college more accessible, I think should be really one of the big goals.
Yeah, that is a great goal. Have you put any thinking toward that large design problem of bringing the cost down for the system at large? Any thoughts in that direction?
I wish I did. I mean, I feel like that's a little bit above my pay grade to figure out the cost. How to bring the cost of college down. There's really smart people thinking about it and working on it, and I hope
Hmm.
they're able to figure it out. I do hope that schools recognize that the urgency there. You just mentioned that there's the content creator element and influence of on higher education. I think there's probably I'm not the first one to say this, but like the Gen Z generation is slightly, maybe less interested in going to college than the millennials, and part of that is because of the debt that the millennial generation had to take on,
Hmm.
and younger people are looking at that and saying, I don't want that, and especially when it's not guaranteeing me a job anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. So access, I think, is one component that every senior administrator needs to be considering, especially
Hmm.
as it relates to remaining relevant within the marketplace. The other place that we hear a lot that is of importance is to have more skills based education built into the curriculum
Yeah.
so that you have like transferable skills within the job market. And I know that you've cited companies like Google or Delta Airlines, IBM even,
Hmm.
who've shifted hiring focus from like strict degree requirements to rather like skills and what kind of skills based demonstration can you provide in that hiring process. Do you see that shift equally healthy for the curriculum and for the position that higher education takes in one's kind of transformative journey from high school into marketplace?
I think ultimately, yeah, there might be some friction there in the beginning. Maybe there's friction now because schools might see that the skills based hiring as being in competition with what they do. But I don't think they have to be. I think there's a lot of good groups out there. One comes to mind, Multiverse, this company that works mainly out of the UK. They actually work with schools to develop skills based curriculums and stuff like that. So like I do think that you know, figuring out what the job market needs, and then tailoring your school programs to that, I think is obviously a good thing. The other aspect of skills based hiring that is crucially important is it gives people who don't have access to school at all a different way into a job market. And
Hmm.
companies like Google, you mentioned Google, IBM, Delta Airlines, they're doing it largely, I think, out of necessity. There was this tightness in the labor market, and they need people, they need workers.
Hmm.
And one of the things they realized was that some of these degree requirements were a little strict, especially when we're talking about middle skills jobs that didn't necessarily need a college degree, 10, 20 years ago. And now suddenly they do. So in a way, we're recalibrating. I hope anyway that we're recalibrating what the job market looks like for folks who want to work in a job that's middle skills.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. So just to follow on question to that, then, if we look at private and public sectors, so say state government
Mhm.
sectors and nonprofit, as well as private enterprise, if the hiring managers of these entities were to eliminate college degrees as a requirement for job hiring, what are the potential consequences? It sounds like you're saying we're just recalibrating,
Yeah.
but if we were to continue to go that direction, do you see any consequences to that?
Yeah, it's really hard to predict what the big picture consequences would be. I would say that in the small scale, like you can give people a pathway into a career. That's the first step. The second step is the companies have to then, I think, be a little more proactive in advancing their own employees and giving their own employees career development. And that part of that comes from on the job training that some of these groups I just mentioned, like Multiverse, also can provide. And I think maybe schools could be involved in providing on the job training. This would give companies uh, more opportunity to take the employees that they hired through a skills based approach and then advance them. And you create a more, I think, loyal employee in that regard because you're investing in the employee's future. There's a few tools out there now that actually rate companies based on how well they advance their own employees. I think AT&T was like the top company, and it was called the
Mm-hmm.
Opportunity Index or something like that. So I
Yeah.
think that, like, the bigger consequence could be a shift in where companies are a little bit more invested in the employees that they have.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's certainly a way, since there is a, um, a high demand for high quality talent, and it's a very competitive marketplace in terms of finding those best fit candidates for any role. So this could become an advantage, or a benefit to the employee if in fact that company or that organization is offering skills-based learning that happens on the job, and they're taking, a real deep interest in
Yeah.
advancing those employees, and showing, personal ownership and personal responsibility for the development of those employees. Does that also work? So to me, that makes a lot of sense in terms of hard skills or, technical skills needed for the job.
Yeah.
But there are those jobs like journalism that
Hmm.
require critical thinking and intellectual growth and maturity in thought and perspective. So do you see advancing intellectual growth and stimulating the intellect and the cognitive abilities or the soft skills? Do you see that as part of on the job training as well?
I do see that as part of life experience. Yeah. And I think I do see it's not necessarily on the job training, but I can say in my case, this is just one person's example, but, some of that stuff that you just mentioned, intellectual development and maturity comes with working
Hmm.
and with working in a career and working toward advancing that yourself in that career. Journalism is a unique example because it's a crucially important industry in terms of like helping us understand the world and who tells stories about the world. And what you that's a to me uh, that's an industry you really don't want to wall off. You don't
Hmm.
want to wall that off. You don't want to just make that too exclusive, because then you have basically just a certain type of person um, telling the stories that about the world and providing the facts and information that people really need. So I think that, like, yeah, Columbia J School can produce great journalists, and they obviously do. But I don't think it should be the only path the only path forward, even in an industry like journalism that is typically seen as being on the more academic side of things.
Yeah. You did a piece, I think it was for the New York Times, that talked about how there's some HR software that's
Yeah.
like unfairly filtering out or sorting the working population resumes based on higher ed credentials. Do you remember that piece?
Yeah, I do. I remember my experience with them, with those they
Okay.
call them applicant tracking systems. I remember being on the wrong side of those
Uh-oh.
systems for sure.
Yeah. And in that experience, do you see like a fundamental design change that needs to happen within that software, or is there a preferred way for a hiring manager to quickly sort candidates, or is that just too much of an ideal?
Yeah, no, I think that there are design elements, there are design changes that could happen to make those systems a little more fair. Harvard Business School actually studied this very phenomenon, and I think they estimated it was something like, I want to say 34 million um, estimated 34 million workers were being hidden from the job market because of some of these systems that are in place that really just sort of are built to weed them out.
Hmm.
I my own personal experience on in that on the wrong side of that was when I think I had about a decade of experience. This is what I write about in the New York Times, a decade of experience in journalism. So I was pretty established. I got laid off at this one place that I worked at, and then I thought, well, sure, I got laid off, but the world's my oyster now. I have a decade of experience. I've been, I've been an editor, I've been a writer and reporter. I've worked on 4 different continents. Like, I should be able to just get another job. And I remember I couldn't even get my resume seen because because people were sending it back saying you don't have the required bachelor's. Um, you don't have the minimum bachelor requirement, so we can't. This job requires that, so you don't get through the system. That was in the cases where I actually emailed the HR people directly to say what's going on, how come no one's getting back to me. Sometimes I assume, sometimes I wouldn't even get that far because the resume just goes into some the rejection pile by rote,
Hmm.
by default. And I don't think my experience is unusual. But to answer your question about design, I think a lot of these the people who use these applicant tracking systems now do recognize that some of the filters they have in place are not necessarily fair. It's a tough challenge because you're talking about really complicated software.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't have all the answers, but I do think it's good that they're thinking about it, and there's probably people in the world of software that are trying to figure out a better way.
Yeah. Well, I've seen recently a lot of job titles will and job descriptions will post as their requirement a certain level of education or degree requirement
Yeah,
or the equivalent and work experience. So
yeah.
maybe it's as simple as changing those systems to filter kind of with two criteria in mind versus just a single rubric or a single piece of criteria.
I mean, you just hit it right there. That's so important. That but I think it comes with being intentional about it. And I think that companies for a long time didn't necessarily even think about it. They just said, "Yeah, you need a bachelor's degree to work here." And I think now, because the discussion is happening, companies can be a little bit more intentional, and they can think about what does each role really require. And in some cases, like you just said, it could be bachelor's degree is great, but also if you have 5 years of experience actually working in this industry, we'll take that too. And I think that like that's a win-win because it's better for workers and it's better for companies.
Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of access, thinking about it from the college application standpoint, so there's the job application standpoint that we're talking about with the HR software.
Yeah,
And then there's the college application software and system. And that's largely dependent on GPA, a student's financial ability to actually carry the tuition fee or their access to scholarship or loans. Are there other filters? Like, what's the equivalent of or relevant job experience for the college applicant? I'm wondering about that.
yeah. So that gets, I think, probably back to um, the design problem that you just mentioned. I
Mm-hmm.
think that when we talk about how to measure skills,
Mm-hmm.
it does get a little bit challenging. There's some agreement that this needs to happen. There's probably a lot of disagreement on where that where those how those how those parameters are set. Now, I
Yeah.
do think that like a simple thing is don't just automatically filter out resumes based on a bachelor's degree if you're
Yeah.
hiring for a job that doesn't necessarily need it. That's a simple thing. I think the harder thing is how do we then measure equivalent experience and what that means.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would hope that there's pretty good software out there that could achieve that.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that we've been advocating for quite a bit in terms of the college application is taking your university's values or like your guiding principles, the things that are near and dear to the identity of the university or the college, and articulating some form of question. It's more qualitative, but like a
Yeah,
prompt or a question within the application process that asks, how do you feel about the value of innovation? Or tell us a time in your life when you displayed integrity, and kind of honing in on the best fit student, not necessarily from a GPA standpoint or financial background profile, but more from a set of values and principles, and kind of getting at the core of who the individual is. It's more like that psychographic mapping
yeah,
than the demographic mapping that I think is more standard. But in that way,
yeah.
you at least know you have students who may not have the perfect academic score that you're looking for, but they're aligned on the values of what the institution supports and believes in.
Yeah, I think that's a great philosophy and probably a great way to really find the best students that are the best fit. I think it's somewhat in some ways it replicates the interview process for a job. When you go
Yeah.
into an actual interview, if God willing, you actually get the interview, they're going to ask you questions like that. They're going to ask you, why do you want to work here? What do you want to achieve in 5 years and things like that. So you're trying to get a well-rounded view of the person. I think in the case of schools, it makes sense to do that, and for employers as well.
Yeah. So you can pull out your magic wand now, and you're gonna wave your magic wand and say, okay, this is what I wish for the future of higher education,
Yeah.
how it can be more equitable, more inclusive, more accessible? What does that vision look like?
Cheaper schools, I think, is probably the first thing I would say. That sticker shock, I think it's just such a barrier for people. And I don't think that what I'm saying here is a revelation by any means. But the schools, the society has to figure out how to make education more affordable. And I don't have the answer to how to do that. But if I had a magic wand, I could make that happen. Um, and I think you would solve a lot of problems there. From the student perspective, maybe the schools would then find themselves in financial dire straits. I don't really know, but if I have the magic wand, that's I think what I would wish for.
That is a simple wish that yes, that one day perhaps in an ideal society
I'm the
we'll
first one to say it. Yeah,
see that. Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. We never hear cheaper schools or cheaper tuition.
yeah.
No,
Cheaper
that
tuition is really what I meant, but you know what I mean.
yeah, that's a great wish. Any final thoughts? Given think about your audience, think about your
Yeah.
experience, and obviously the huge amount of success that you've had as a journalist. Thank you for lending your perspective and your expertise today. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Yeah, look, if I'm speaking directly to people who work, in the world of higher education, I would say try to think about who you think your typical student is, your ideal student, the person you really think is the type of student you want to go after, and then ask yourself if that's really the ideal student. I think this translates well into the job market as well, because we assume that we know what we're looking for as employers, as people who are dating, in the world as consumers. And I think maybe schools also somewhat assume they know what they're looking for in a student. My words of wisdom there is you don't always know what you're looking for. So think about ways that you can open up your idea of what the ideal student is, and you might find that your student body is then more reflective of the broader world.
Love that. Christopher Zara, ladies and gentlemen, with the final thought on this wonderful higher ed happy hour. What's the best way to connect with you if someone wants to reach out and learn more from you or continue to follow you?
Sure. You can. Well, I hope people will check out the book Uneducated. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, bookshop.org, or anywhere that books are sold. I have a website, ChristopherZara.com. And of course, I'm the senior editor on the news desk at Fast Company. So I still write a lot too. I'm mostly an editor, but once in a while I still write and I still report. So you can find me at fastcompany.com as well.
Excellent. I'm sure people will take you up on that. Thank you again for your time, Christopher. It's
Thank
been
you,
a pleasure
Ian.
to have you on today and sharing a really unique perspective. We don't always have this type of discussion and this type of perspective on the show. So it's been
Cool.
refreshing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.